And we are joined now by Nick Marx, one of the authors of That's Not Funny, How the Right Makes Comedy Work for Them. Nick, thanks so much for being here today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
So, right-wing comedy should sound like an oxymoron, I think, to a good percentage of our audience, right? But, your book actually contends that we need to be taking it seriously as a phenomenon, and I think a lot longtime viewers of this program or even casual viewers know we spend a lot of time mocking right-wing comedy, but it is I think our way of combating it and getting into the algorithm because it can be so pernicious. What inspired you to write about it, and what inspired you to say, hey, let's take this seriously and acknowledge it really from like a sociological perspective?
So, two things really. The start of the Trump administration really created a permission structure for more kind of informal, let's call it, forms of address, public discourse, and joking, mean spirited joking, to occur in formal political spaces. He wasn't necessarily the cause of it, but maybe the most sort of prominent face of a movement happening over the last 5 to 10 years. And what we see happening at the same time is an opening in media industries where nobody's really occupied this lane economically. So there hadn't been an institution devoted to conservative comedy in the same way that liberals have long had institutions like Saturday Night Live, The Daily Show. So we see a couple of failed attempts to do this, most notably Fox News' half-hour news hour in 2007. Yes, a very regrettable,
Yeah.
bad attempt to be The Daily Show, but they try and eventually succeed with a handful of the folks that we talk about in the book. At the same time, liberals are kind of tunnel visioned into thinking that we own comedy. We're the party of Jon Stewart, of Stephen Colbert, of Sacha Baron Cohen, all these sort of brilliant liberal comedians that we've had over the last 2 decades. And we kind of fall into this trap of thinking that comedy has a politically liberal orientation and that anything that falls outside of our political goals must not be comedy. It must be something else. So it's kind of a two-pronged thing where conservatives are rising in the comedy world at the same time liberals are tunnel visioned on celebrating our own satirists.
Yeah, and there's two responses I have to that. One is I think the liberal can be distinct from leftist, and the comedy that comes out of a Jon Stewart to a degree is different than I would say comedy that's a bit more challenging of institutions. And secondly, when oh damn, I just lost my second point. But I guess when you bring up right wing comedy, I'm thinking right now of someone like Dave Chappelle or a lot of comics who were not perceived as a part of a right wing ethos, but they are tapping into a reactionary impulse about trans people in particular, and that's gaining a lot of steam.
Yeah, absolutely. So to take those one by one, we use the terms liberal and leftist interchangeably, not because I think they're interchangeable. I myself identify as a leftist, but we kind of are making a broad sort of coalitional point that, hey, we got to work together to sort of combat this. The second characterization of right-wing comedians like Chappelle as reactionary, I think is spot on. He happens to be maybe a very public, high-profile case, as is somebody like Joe Rogan, who tends to have some reactionary views too. But they're just the sort of tip of the spear. There's a whole universe, including personalities on Fox News like Greg Gutfeld and Jesse Waters, podcasters like the Legion of Skanks, and even folks who are kind of much more nefarious, fascist adjacent sort of podcasters, streamers who are very avowedly right wing, and to call them conservative would be a sort of polite nod to their politics. I think Chappelle right now is an interesting case because he's kind of going where the money is. I think he sees that the lane he previously occupied has now been populated by new and upcoming and more interesting voices, and he's hanging out with Rogan and Austin and appearing at some of these spots, and maybe Elon Musk is in the periphery somewhere. That libertarian tech bro scene, I think, has filtered into his sensibility a little bit. But whatever it is about the trans issue, that seems to be a very sort of dividing line between these comedians who want to veer leftward versus the ones that might see a more fertile economic space on the right.
And your book talks really about how a lot of the comedic the impulses for some of these right-wing comedians or the audience they're trying to cultivate, it's a very male and it's a very white audience. What is it about the trans issue in particular, the trans issue, but the trans people and demonizing trans people and hating on them in what's using the trappings of comedy as a way to do so? What is it about that I think hits on all those points?
Yeah, if another comedy outlet we talk about in the book is the Babylon Bee, and they go to this well often, sort of the pronoun sets of jokes and talking about trans confusions with gender identities. We talk in the book about a robust body of social science research that says conservatives can't deal with ambivalence. They don't like unresolved issues, ideas, identity categories. That's why they tend to hold to sort of firmly thought out identity positions and political ideologies, whereas liberals tend to embrace ambivalence and sort of ambiguous forms of joking and discourse. I think trans debates happens to be the sort of talking point that's cycling through the comedy world right now. Lord knows it'll become something else in 2-3 years when a new sort of issue arises. Maybe 10, 15 years ago, it would have been gay marriage, right? But the sort of issue of gender remains pretty prominent in that world of humor.
Yeah. So what do you attribute that to in terms of that not maybe 15 years ago it being about gay people? And I mean, there's like Andrew Dice Clay or people like that from that time period. But why now? What has created, is it Trump, would you say, that's given this, taken us to this inflection point in this period? How would you, what's your best guess about that?
Is it Trump that's taken us to the inflection point about trans issues or
yeah,
others?
why? I mean, there of course were comedians making fun of gay people before this, but I feel like now there's much more of an appetite for that kind of mockery towards trans people, different from and distinct from 15 years ago.
Yeah, it's a good question, and not one I'm sure I have total authority to speak on, other than to identify it as a sort of cultural issue that the right is struggling to gain territory on. If we take seriously, as I do, the sort of Breitbartian edict that politics is downstream from culture, they hold political control, right? They're a sort of minority rule of political power in the country. So they spend all their time with the Ben Shapiro's of the world, Steven Crowder's of the world, complaining about being canceled for cultural issues, right? I think part of it has to do with a kind of underlying libertarian ethos to a lot of their comedy too. Because this is an issue that exists in the public sphere, I must take the most extreme humorous viewpoint possible on it. If I'm not taking that extreme viewpoint, then I'm not being funny, right? Then I'm not doing justice to my sort of political perspective. Again, I can't say with any certainty why the sort of trans debate cycles through their comedy universe so prominently. It almost certainly has to do with the presence of overwhelmingly cisgendered white men leading this comedy movement. But beyond that, I'm just not sure.
So let's your book kind of works to with the least extreme with Fox News. You start in, I believe, your second chapter talking about the half-hour news hour, and now Gutfeld's show, which is surprisingly doing well in the ratings. And then you move towards gradually becoming more extreme towards neo-Nazi comedy, meme, edgelord stuff. And all of this is a part of the same whole. But let's start there where with Fox, because it's the most digestible form of this kind of hateful comedy for a lot of people. I think you described it as this complex is Walmart, right? Where it's a one-stop shop for people. uh, what did you find in your study of Fox's approach to right-wing comedy?
Yeah, so we use the metaphor of a mixed-use shopping complex to describe the right-wing comedy industry. So it's got a big box store in the form of Greg Gutfeld and Jesse Waters on Fox News. And this is the mainstream form of it, the one that might be most familiar to folks watching late night television, to industry people tracking it, right, to competitors like Colbert and The Daily Show and others. And what we find with Gutfeld is a straight up late night comedy talk show. He is generically exactly the same as Trevor Noah is on Comedy Central. That's not to say that their jokes are the same or that I find it funny, but the host Gutfeld does a monologue. He riffs on headlines of the day. He's got an Ed McMahon-like sidekick in Tyrus, this hulking former wrestler, an in-house group of sketch players, not unlike what Conan O'Brien had back in the day. And so generically, industrially, it is a late night comedy talk show. But what we find throughout discussions of Gutfeld is that people are hesitant to call it that. Academics like myself are reluctant to apply that label. Trade magazines like The Hollywood Reporter call it comedy oriented and not necessarily an out and out comedy show like you might call Colbert. Because I think there's this ingrained reluctance to acknowledge something that is conservative and is funny can exist in the world. You used the word oxymoronic earlier on in the conversation. And I think that's the kind of implicit logic a lot of folks on the left have, is that, well, those two things can't possibly go together, so it must be something else. It must be this extension of Fox's kind of outrage programming. And to be clear, there is a good deal of that. There are the sort of personality cycling through the show to just sort of shake their fist at the cloud and be angry about open borders or whatever the case is. But there are setups and punchlines and a studio audience who's laughing at Gutfeld and all the sort of familiar beats you might expect in a sort of mainstream comedy show like we have on the broadcast networks.
And then you move into the Ben Shapiro's and Steven Crowder's of the world, who we are way too familiar with here at the Majority Report. Crowder is a great example, I think, for your thesis here, because he is constantly, doing these bits and dressing up and things like that. And in particular, I would say his comedy attempts. I have a hard time not couching it. I'm sorry, but it's about directly harassing and joking about minority groups or gay people or trans people. I mean, in watching his programming and in writing about it, what were some of the through lines that you found?
Yeah, I think just as you described it, his is a comedy of owning the libs. It may not always be the same as a stand-up performer getting on stage doing a traditional routine, even though he's tried that and failed pretty horribly at it. But he is the change my mind guy, right? I'm sure your viewers know, but he sets his card table up on college campuses with a sign that says there are only two genders, change my mind. And these well-meaning college kids stumble out of their women's studies classes and debate him. And Crowder says, well, if there are infinite number of genders, how many genders are there? So it's not necessarily the familiar kind of joking convention we see in sitcoms and late night TV, but his is a humor of superiority. It's finding a weaker, more marginalized cultural subject and pointing down at them, laughing at them in order to unite like-minded people behind him. You see this very explicitly in many of those Change My Mind videos. He's got a crowd of people around him. He's got somebody who's going to be the target of his jokes, and he punches down at them. And you hear the crowd laughing behind him in much the same way that a stand-up might be doing crowd work to somebody who's heckling them, right? Again, it's not necessarily always funny, but it is grounded in the sort of unifying principle of in-groups and out-groups. He's very explicit about trying to create a dividing line between people who believe what I do, there are only two genders, and then there's the loony libs who we're going to laugh at and we're going to own them with our humor.
Yeah, and there is a lot that Trump borrows from all of these people, right? I mean,
No.
I've gotten into debates with liberal family members, particularly older people, like who, they don't see Trump as funny because they find him offensive, and of course he's an odious human being, but he's also an insult comic,
Yeah.
and that is and not understanding that means you don't understand Donald Trump, in my opinion. And he also has those same principles of punching down at other groups. And I'm wondering how much of his persona was reminiscent in studying someone like Crowder and other right wingers in your book.
Yeah, he absolutely looms very large over many of the case studies in this book, especially somebody like Crowder and to a lesser extent Shapiro, who's kind of this ringleader for many of the comedians we talk about. The cruelty is the point, right? And it's undeniable to acknowledge that humor is a part of that cruelty. It's a part of that unifying principle behind, mocking the disabled reporter or calling Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas, or on and on and on. The number of times he's name called, that he's punched down at people in positions of lower authority than him. So the point is to move the discussion about what is and is not comedy away from a taste-based evaluation. So I don't think he's funny, but I'm not going to deny that he's trying to be funny, or that he can be funny for his political adherents. So for too long, we've categorized comedy very subjectively. We've used our own taste to say what is and is not comedy, but we don't do that with other art forms. We might not like a painting hanging in a museum, but we wouldn't deny that it is a painting, right? We tend not to use that taste-based distinction in other art forms. But for so long, especially in political comedy, we've used our taste to say, no, Jon Stewart is funny because I agree with him. Steven Crowder is not because he's just angry all the time, right? Or Donald Trump is just being vicious or mean or angry. And that's absolutely true, but he is also trying to be funny for his audience.
What do you think the danger is in not recognizing that on the left?
Yeah, so the one of the bigger points we try to make is the attractiveness of this art form for young male listeners and viewers. Overwhelmingly, the folks listening to Rogan, to Legion of Skanks, to other forms of right-wing comedy are these kind of politically neutral, still in formation, young male listeners. And so the danger is that this cultural form is used to recruit them to right-wing causes, to the Republican Party, to incorporate them into the voting base as that right-leaning voting base ages out and dies, or whatever the case is. I don't have hardcore sort of sociological statistics saying X number of folks are joining the Republican Party based on listening to these programs, but
no, it's
industry,
obvious. Yeah, right.
If you listen to Rogan and the Libertarian podcast, the ad spots, the ad reads he does are overwhelmingly for 22-year-old dudes, right? It's off-brand Viagra and Butcher Box and all these things that you buy if you've got a disposable income.
Okay, and so you mentioned Rogan there, right? That's somebody who you explore in your fourth chapter as we begin to go down this wormhole. He's constantly couching his right-wing framing in, hey, I'm just a dude, I'm just a podcaster, don't take me super seriously, which I think is a real hallmark of right-wing influencers to a degree, is a denial that they are political, because it is a way to sell a right-wing framing to people who might not want to see themselves as a right-winger, particularly young men, when it's not terribly fashionable in my age group to be a right-winger. What were some of the hallmarks of his show that you found notable?
Yeah, so Rogan's a tricky figure because he's not got politics, he's got demographics. I think his first mission is to serve this very lucrative young male listening audience, 10 million, 11 million listeners per episode, to Spotify and to his advertisers. he's someone who's been on mic and doing stand-up and in the public eye long enough that he can plausibly affirm or deny any given political ideology. And he often does, right? He says, oh, I had Bernie Sanders on, but of course he flipped to Trump after Sanders dropped out. The point with Rogan, though, is not necessarily to catch him as a right-wing ideologue according to what he says, but it's the connections he has to all these other figures, many of whom we cover in the book, but all these other figures in the conservative political world, in the right-wing cultural universe, overwhelmingly picture him as somebody libertarian, as somebody right-wing sympathetic. So the recommendations, for instance, that pop up when you listen to the Rogan experience regularly are podcasters like Legion of Skanks, whom we talk about, Michael Malice, who then connect you to other further right, further fascist adjacent kind of nefarious characters who exist in the basement of this complex that we talk about. But I often have students tell me very understandably, oh, Rogan's my favorite podcaster because he just kind of tells it like it is. And it's easy to imagine, them hanging out with Rogan, just getting high and talking shit with their bros. And that's fine. I'm not here to judge anybody's preference for listening to that. But it's the industry built around Rogan. Once you go in the front door of what Rogan has to show you, he takes you back to the back room where a guy is going to sell you something even more sort of pernicious and influencing you to go further and further down this kind of fascist right-wing rabbit hole.
How do you respond to the Rogan fans who say, well, look, he's had Bernie Sanders on, or he's had Cornel West on, or he's had some lefties on? I mean, to me, I don't listen to Rogan at all, really, except for the purposes of my job to disentangle some of his right-wing stuff. But it's clear to me that those are outliers. But I'm curious what your response is to that claim.
The first response is what you just said. The centrist to left personalities he has on are outliers compared to the dozens and even hundreds of Milo Yiannopoulos and Jordan Petersons and all these people who become associated in a bigger context with conservative political causes and with right-wing cultural issues. The second bigger point that I would make is look at the industry built up around him. Look at who he hangs out with. Look at the shows that he guests on and the people who go to guest on other shows. Who does he go on tour with? Who are the sort of people advertising on his show? Over and over again, it pushes in the rightward direction and paints a picture of somebody who is skeptical of trans rights, right? All the sort of left-oriented issues we've been talking about. Overwhelmingly, he's angry about, skeptical of. He doesn't like institutional voices when it comes to COVID vaccines and on and on. So the small slice that he can point to justifiably saying, no, man, I'm pro-marijuana legalization, or I'm going to have Bernie Sanders on, pales in comparison to the bigger constellation of right-wing personalities that he pals around with.
And you mentioned just the ecosystem around him as well. Like Jordan Peterson, you could really draw a line to his career trajectory now as a almost exclusively anti-trans contributor to the Daily Wire, as a function of Rogan's platforming. I mean, that was very huge, instrumental to his rise.
Yeah, precisely. So Rogan kind of provides the joking entree into these more sort of self-serious political domains that Jordan Peterson occupies, or that various libertarian thinkers like him occupy as well. So the sort of comedy that forms the basis of how Rogan interacts with guests, the just bullshitting with the fellas kind of vibe, opens the door to more politically serious conversations and ideologies if a listener wishes to pursue them.
And lastly, speaking of Rogan guests, Gavin McInnes is someone you highlight in your final chapter, I believe, or chapter 5, where you and your co-author, who I believe, I'm so sorry I did not say his name, if you don't mind plugging him for a sec.
Yeah, it's Matt Sienkiewicz.
Matt Sienkiewicz.
Mhm.
Yes. You both write about the kind of final stage in a radicalization wormhole, which is basically neo-Nazi edgelord meme stuff,
Mhm.
Gavin McGinnis, the Boogaloo Boys, these kinds of folks. Um, that's when you get into incredibly scary territory, but it's also just the natural progression of when you fall into these
Yeah.
radicalizing traps.
Yeah, so crucially, we're not saying that Greg Gutfeld, Joe Rogan are the same as these fascist and neo-Nazi podcasts we talk about later in the book. But our hope is to highlight that it's possible to get there, right? If you spend enough time in this right-wing comedy complex, you eventually get connected to via social media algorithms, via guests on various podcasts, recommendations to these sort of more nefarious characters. And indeed, it's not that tough to get there in the form of McGinnis, who was a pretty regular guest on Fox News shows like Red Eye, which Greg Gutfeld hosted for years before getting his own show. He's circulated through the sort of hipster Vice universe of New York in the 2000s before turning hard into the right wing universe and trying to be funny while doing it with this trolling vibe that he's got, right? Just kidding, just joking. As a leader of the Proud Boys, I don't endorse any of the sort of violent acts they're doing. That's all just a humorous facade, except and until his Proud Boys actually go out and beat up journalists and harass Black Lives Matter protesters. So he's among the more sort of above ground public faces of this sort of trolling universe that we describe. When you get to the really subterranean stuff, the things that Google won't even bring to your first couple of pages of searches, there are out and out Nazis who routinely joke about Holocaust and Jews who control media industries, right? They are not doing this with any sort of sheen of irony. They are very nakedly open about how hateful and fascistic they are in their ideas. But again, the element of owning the left, of making a sort of in group of fascist ideologues laugh along with you is core to their appeal. They're not just angry, they're not just hateful. They are making jokes in the same way that any other comedian might to create an in-group and an out-group.
And to bring it back to Trump, because I really see him as the culmination of a lot of these dynamics, given again the edgelord, 4chan guys love that he owns the libs through his relentless trolling. I mean, he is the ultimate troll, and that is kind of, I think, key to their identity. And humor is a way for people to identify themselves, what people connect to and what people find funny. And Steve Bannon, recently convicted Steve Bannon, found this to be a really a way to radicalize young men, essentially. Through Gamergate, he understood that there were a group of online men who found solace in forums and found solace in this kind of edgy comedy. And so that all ties together, in my opinion, to build a young, alt-right, angry base of largely white male right-wingers that becomes a very dangerous situation. And we see their influence on mass shooters. And we also see that this is a way to keep the right-wing project younger, and however hateful they are, how anti-Semitic, racist, transphobic, gay, doesn't matter, because honestly that makes them probably more useful for the right if they're more engaged in that way.
That's totally right. The Bannon radicalizing gamers example is a great sort of analog to what we view potentially happening with comedy. It's a very online form of discourse, so folks engaging in it don't ever really have to suffer the real world consequences or meet the objects of their joking derision. It's something that is available to anybody as a result, right? If you're sort of siloed in your own little social media filter bubble, you can just joke around with people who think the same way you do and not have to be exposed to anybody outside of it. And then what's more, we see this mode of joking filter back up to the people who hold power in right-wing thought. I'm forgetting the conference, y'all talked about it on the show earlier this week, where Ted Cruz and Matt Gaetz came out.
Turning Points USA.
Turning Point, yeah. The Charlie Kirk conference. So, you know, that whole sort of, they had like pro wrestler introductions, and they were trying to make jokes, right? They were trying to be funny because they knew that they were at a gathering of mostly young white men, and that was the sort of mode of discourse that would resonate with them. Not conventional policy-oriented speeches, but I'm forgetting that, didn't Ted Cruz have some punchline about his pronouns being F that or something?
Yeah,
like that?
pronouns are kiss my ass. If you think of somebody who's less naturally funny, even he is trying to be funny.
So they're reaching for that branch of humor now, even if it's going to snap off on them, because they know it's an attractive thing to kind of bring in that young male voting base.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Nick Marx. You can read his book, That's Not Funny, How the Right Makes Comedy Work for Them, along with his co-author, Matt Sienkiewicz. Thank you so much, Nick, for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Emma.
Of course.